This is an RNZ podcast.
It is time to talk media with Mr. Midweek Mediawatch and Mr. Mediawatch. He can do it all. Colin Peacock, who is with me.
I can do both things. Yeah.
from the studio in Wellington. It's been a week in the media, hasn't it, Cole?
Yeah, I heard you saying that earlier, and I was making up the webpage for our Midweek Mediawatch podcast that we'll put to air later, and it kind of pumped me up. I was all tabloid, writing headlines, BBC bloodbath, shocker coppers to Pāti Māori meltdown, as I heard you trailing all these things. So maybe I just got to dial it back a bit more and be a bit more responsible.
That's going to take up the bulk of this next 25 minutes, is those three stories. Let's start with the BBC. Big media story of the week so far. The BBC's top boss and head of news have both quit after big-time controversy over dodgy editing of President Trump. What's the story, Cole?
Yeah, well, that was the trigger for it, but clearly much more in the background for those two very senior people to quit their jobs. It has happened before, I have to say, back in 2004. So I actually worked there in BBC newsrooms up until the early 2000s, and soon after I left, although the two things are not related, but Greg Dyke, the then Director General, quit. That was after the Hutton inquiry. This is about the so-called dodgy dossier in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, all of that. That was a huge deal, and the Director General, and I think the chair of the BBC, fell on their sword over this journalistic issue at that time. 2012, short-lived, a newly appointed Director General called George Entwistle, quit after barely getting his feet under the table because of fallout from the Jimmy Savile stuff and a related Panorama program about another conservative politician, serious allegations that didn't quite stand up there. So again, the top boss did go because of journalism. This is different though, because as people probably already know, a documentary screened a year ago, BBC Panorama, a very established documentary strand. They have selectively edited parts of Trump's January the 6th speech at the Capitol. And that made it sound as if he had directly urged people to go and cause trouble in the Capitol, although, middle section, about 50 minutes worth of his
Quite a lot
speech
was cut out,
was missing. Yeah. So, both the Director General, Tim Davie, and the News CEO, that's the current title, Deborah Turnus, have insisted. The buck stops with them. What's interesting is the outgoing news CEO has pointedly said there is no systemic bias at the BBC, which is kind of at odds with what the guy who wrote this so-called dossier that leaked out in the press that prompted the crisis and the other critics of the BBC claim.
So, controversy over the Trump edit fail had been going on for some time. This is not new to the discourse. But these resignations, right from the top as well, were they a surprise to you?
Well, I think they were, because when it actually happened, it was our time about between 7 and 8 a.m. And I switched into British news sources to see, in live feeds and that, just to see how they were doing it. And they were clearly talking as if since, I think, the Monday previous, the sort of dossier that had first revealed that the dodgy editing of the Trump Panorama program had not been properly handled by BBC management, that was building up a bit, and that the Director General was under pressure. But clearly the correspondents that were rushed on air and the presenters were not at all expecting this to happen. So they were definitely taken by surprise. It was also it was a Sunday night, and it was Remembrance Day, their Veterans Day, so very different, but definitely not sort of peak news time. But one of the outlets I listened to as it was all breaking was the British Sky TV News. And their political correspondent, Katie Spencer, rushed to get on air on a phone, and she described it as inevitable that the Director General will go, and she kind of ran through a roll call of problems that he'd been facing.
The issue with Glastonbury and the Israeli death chants that were aired on the BBC iPlayer, which he managed to avoid having to resign over that. Then also there was the Gaza documentary, where it emerged that one of the narrators of a documentary that was put onto the BBC iPlayer was the child of a member of Hamas. I think on top of those two issues, his role as chairman really was becoming completely untenable. And then on top of that, just in the last week, he's had an incredible amount of pressure over the Panorama documentary and how President Trump was edited.
Yeah, and then she went on to say there was the Hugh Edwards thing, the conviction. But that was a personal conduct matter. She had the Gary Lineker, the football presenter, former footballer who had expressed political views, potentially compromised BBC impartiality. But that was handled pretty well in the end. But as she and others were saying, there was this kind of pile-up of issues that those who were minded to think that the BBC was compromised, that he couldn't stay on in the job because he wasn't going to be the guy who could put it right. Yeah,
it seems a bit like the owning of this mistake through that symbolic stepping down of those two high-placed people has kind of been sort of the lid off the pressure cooker, right?
Yeah.
And the stew is spread everywhere now.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely,
a terrible metaphor, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but it's partly because of, US, Donald Trump, because it involves him, and British political pressure and sort of cultural battles going on. And whereas the BBC, as we know, it's the biggest broadcaster in the world, and the Director General is overseeing all of that. So it kind of might have made sense if the head of news had gone alone. But if that's what it's all about, accountability for these kind of journalistic errors, it doesn't make sense to me that the Director General should go unless they have some sort of succession plan or idea of who they want to appoint, who could change the direction of the corporation if that's what its governors and its stakeholders in the British government have decided it needs.
Panorama is a long-standing BBC show. It has a pretty good reputation, you'd probably say, all considered. But this episode was actually produced by an outside company, which is an interesting element to this.
Yeah, not much mentioned, but a company called October Films. And because the BBC is so big and it's a kind of shrinking industry, partly because of that, the BBC is obliged to have, I think it's at least a quarter of their content across various outputs produced by the independent production sector. I mean, BBC is still clearly responsible, but I do wonder whether, British political reporters or even the Washington Bureau or North America Bureau of the BBC, if they'd been making this film, Trump, A Second Chance, as it was called, about in the run-up to the 2024 election, whether they would have actually made that editing error. But yeah, as has been pointed out, same with the Gaza one. Remember recently the one that turned out to be narrated by the, teenage son of a Hamas official. That was produced by an independent outfit too. But of course, the buck stops at the BBC. They've got to enforce their own editorial rules.
Quite a bit of glee out there at what is happening here with regard to the BBC. A lot of public commentary, glee from the White House and Donald Trump himself, but also from the BBC's competitors, the commercial media sector in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Alistair Campbell on that Rest is Politics, a very popular podcast, said, I can't understand the degree to which the BBC sort of platforms its enemies and goes to them. The first person on the BBC TV news channel, which is the outlet for breaking news domestically in the UK, that they got on to talk about this was Kelvin Mackenzie.
It was amazing. Yeah,
well, but he was Rupert Murdoch's top tabloid editor, an absolute enemy and critic, and not necessarily in good faith of the BBC. He subsequently formed a commercial talk radio network, who was active, in the time I was still working there, in condemning the BBC for its advantages and getting, radio sports rights and all that sort of stuff. Massive interest, vested interest in doing the BBC down. And this is what he said on the BBC's own news channel while the news was breaking.
Things like the Trump doctoring of the tape are a massive, massive issue. When you start doing that to the President of the United States, what are you doing to somebody cleaning a window in Preston? If you can't be trusted on that, what can you be trusted on?
Yeah, I mean, someone from the BBC itself, had they been on air, might have said, or one of its defenders was, well, the point is, day after day after day, they do have window cleaners from Preston or whatever on, and, they're treated fairly, and, this quite isolated and frankly very easy to fix mistake. If there'd just been a kind of flash wipe or time code to indicate when they cut together those two bits of Trump that time had passed, it just wouldn't have been an issue. So yeah, I think he also, Kelvin Mackenzie said, what about the BBC have a 60-strong BBC Verify. What are they doing? Are they all at the Christmas party? And they have an explainer up on air with Ros Atkins, who's made that an art form at the BBC, explaining exactly what happened. On another podcast, a former BBC guy, Lewis Goodall, said, look, in this, the anti-BBC people and the pro-Trump populists or apologists, have this kind of huge advantage.
They get away with it because no one expects anything from them. No one expects them to be truthful. Everyone expects them to lie, and yet we expect everything, and we expect almost no mistakes or problems from the people and places and institutions who actually give a damn. And that is why we're in this problem.
Yes, that's why they find it galling, I think, that all the nonsense that comes out of the White House, and yet, the BBC gets pinged for this and the top guy has to go. Yeah, it seems disproportionate to a lot of people.
I found the newsagent's coverage of this to be fascinating because all three of the people who host that podcast, Emily Maitlis, John Sobel and Lewis Goodall, have worked for the BBC in the past. And Colin, they've talked about this at length. I feel like this instance has allowed people an opportunity to really loudly voice their wider criticisms of the BBC and maybe of the media sector in general. And I feel like there is this perception in the UK in particular that over the past 10 years or so, around several sort of hot button cultural issues that the BBC and the wider media maybe have adopted like a soft left position on everything and have not facilitated good faith discussion of some big issues around things like trans rights or around things like the war in Gaza, and that people have kind of been saving up their criticisms, and this has been an opportunity for that to all kind of explode out. Do you get that perception here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one person who said that quite explicitly was a guy called David Elstein, who's a former TV commercial guy, who has criticised the BBC heavily, argued that it should be funded a different way and broken up and all that sort of thing. And he said, look, they're fine, they try hard with their political stuff and their balance, but he referenced specifically trans issues. And trans is a difficult one because obviously opinions are so polarised about it. And for a lot of people, I think even if, they don't really know how best to cover it, if it's people's identity and the human rights are at question here, then, you have to tread carefully with it. But Elstein was saying on the BBC News Channel, while the news was breaking, that the BBC has not moved with public opinion. And then others kind of reacting to this later, or that sentiment, say Lord Patton, who used to be a chair of the BBC Trust. Does this mean, the publicly owned broadcaster is supposed to just reflect the prejudices of the last person who shouted at them? It's getting absurd. And you can't just be guided by public opinion on that. And actually, David Elstein got into quite a funny row with a broadcaster on another one of the BBC's radio networks, a guy called Christopher Nolan.
Nolan?
Sorry, no, his name is Stephen Nolan. Beg your pardon. Yes, Ulsterman, a broadcaster from Northern Ireland. And Elstein was telling Nolan this about accountability.
The BBC is simply not accountable to anyone. It's not accountable to the government. It's not accountable to the Culture Committee. It's not accountable
how is that true? Can you not see the accountability tonight? The Director General's lost his job. Deborah Turnus have lost their job. Ofcom holds the BBC accountable.
No, it doesn't.
There's an editorial complaints unit where the public can well,
have you ever tried to
argue.
Use it? Have you ever tried to use that?
I'm subject to it quite a lot.
Times. And I can tell you, it's largely a waste of time.
I think that's what you were talking about there, an example of it where people felt the criticisms they've had about the organisation the last 10 or 15 years, it all kind of burst out. And when Elstein made that point I mentioned about trans rights and that they'd taken a sort of non-inclusion, a non-diverse position on different matters of opinion on that, Nolan was able to tell him, he'd actually made a 10-part series on this, whether Stonewall and organisations like that had too much influence on public institutions, including the BBC, which sort of shut David Elstein up a little bit.
We're going to talk to Christian Smith a bit about this after 9 as well, and the reaction from the UK. But Colin, it's 10 to, so we better move on and talk about some local stuff and a dramatic announcement at 6 p.m. yesterday in the inquiry into Jevon McSkimming.
Yeah, that's right. Huge news event. And I mean, I just have to say, so much has been said, including earlier tonight on Wallace and with the panel and the whip. But a huge news event Tuesday at 6. So not often do you get a live news conference like that unfolding while the 6 p.m. news hours are on. I mean, it was terrific coverage to sit down and tune into it. I wasn't quite expecting it, so I sat down and watched it almost as an ordinary viewer would. And as the detail was coming out, you're thinking editors are making really interesting choices here. How long do you stick with the news conference? How much detail do you think people need? When do you bring your correspondent in to start summing up? When's the right time? I thought it was all done so well. And then you could also second screen it and see the live blogs on, say, rnz.co.nz or Staff or whatever, the Herald, and pick out the details there, things you heard earlier in the bulletin. Really, really good. And 24 hours later at 6 p.m. tonight, both the 6 p.m. television bulletins, just to pick on those two, had more than 15 minutes each, picking through that, separating out the reporters, giving them, different tasks. So you had Mikey Sherman, Simon Mersep, who seems to be such a great, sum up. I now think of him as that guy who says, here's what we know so far, and just calmly works you through it. 3 News with stuff that we know have, reduced resources these days. They had Zane Small doing the main sort of political wrap-up, Catherine Owen looking at aspects of the report, sitting down in the studio with Sam Hayes. Really, really good. Checkpoint picking out details like, the officer who labelled the allegations from Ms. Z as false, still being in a job and things like that. So much coming out. And then also, really good context too.
I was going to say as well, exactly on this point, that it shows the value in newsrooms of institutional knowledge and beat reporters. Jared Savage at the Herald, really terrific reporting. Sam Sherwood at RNZ, the same. Paula Penfold at Stuff, the same. People who really know this world and have cultivated contacts within it that will speak to them freely and with trust.
Yeah, and can remind you about things like Dame Margaret Baisley's report, was it, almost 15 years ago now. Many people who remember back to that, might have thought these things had been sorted out. And, when we hear these things about institutions where things go wrong and wrongdoing finally comes to light, and then we discover most of the people behind it are no longer in their posts, and the people now in charge say, look, a lot of this has been dealt with, we've moved on. This feels like a sort of pattern, something we've seen before in New Zealand. So journalists that can actually point to this and indicate that, we've been here before and certain things haven't changed, and going back even further, Louis Nicholas and all of that, there is a context to this that's important. And if you don't have really good journalists sifting that out and telling you that along with the here and now. So when you have Carolyn Levitt in Trump's office saying, the BBC is 100% fake news, support GB News instead, listen to them. You wouldn't get that kind of coverage of a national issue from GB News. You'd get kind of foaming at the mouth and, all the things you thought were true, they're all pervert. You would get that. You don't get the sifting out of where the blame really lies, what the most important things are. And it's one of those moments where, you should be glad as a New Zealander that, for all the media's problems, we still have outlets that can report a live event like that. And now, 24 hours later, really help you make sense of it.
A big story in local politics this week, moving on, Colin, the ongoing turbulent story around Pāti Māori and these expulsions.
Yeah, again, like actual political reporters have said so much about it, covered all of this. So I don't have particularly profound things to say about it. But when they had that media conference on Monday to announce their decision, they got reasonable questions. I watched that live again. You could see that live from the tiles in Parliament on news websites, which is great. They were asked very reasonable questions by journalists who wanted to know these actual reasons for expulsion, which was still not clear, how these decisions were reached. They were given different accounts of who really made these decisions, who met at the regional level in their party, and it just wasn't very tidy. But for once, the questions were asked not like that Reset press conference where they just took umbrage and walked away within something like 3.5 minutes. When they got deep into that press conference, one comment by Rawiri Waititi did get my attention, and here it is.
And I must say that the media have enjoyed it over the last 6 weeks. And so we've been having to trail this particular narrative and the propaganda that goes with it, not just in the media, in the mainstream media, but also in social media. And the Court of Public Appeal will run its course.
That's an interesting. Well, I mean, what do you make of the substance of what he says there?
Well, it's something they've said a lot. And indeed, John Tamahere, as party president, has put it even more bluntly when he's talked about, for example, his words, white media feeding frenzy, or words to that effect, saying that the media are unfair or out to get them, giving that message, I guess, to their supporters. But I just don't think it's good faith. I mean, there were other things said in that press conference, like he claimed to have had, discussions with the Labour Party and the Greens about forming a a government. And then Chris Hipkins, the Labour Party, said, no, we haven't spoken to them at all. So this doesn't feel like a full and frank press conference, really. But when he says that, he accuses the news media and social media of racism and propaganda. I mean, it really is not fair. Doesn't do anyone a service to put the news media in with social media in like that. There'll be plenty of propaganda on social media, but some of what he regards as, probably just unfavourable coverage, to label it propaganda, is not fair. And if they're going to say, there was that episode last month, I think, where Debbie Ngarewa-Packer was accusing journalists of harassing them and leaping out of bushes, and Lloyd Burr very aggressively saying, who leapt out of a bush? And it all became kind of comical. But if you're going to keep saying the media are unfair to you, you're going to have to really come up with some examples that make sense if you want the media to engage with you in good faith. And there's an example like ACT, as we know, is not averse to kind of playing to its base, even fundraising on the basis that the media is unfair to them and you can't trust them. But they did use official channels when there was a conflict of interest they saw in reporting by the press about the school lunches issue, and their chief of staff took the time, went through that months-long process to eventually get a complaint upheld on that basis that, the press's journalist did have a prior employment that should have been declared to readers and wasn't. So I thought that was pretty good. But when Rawiri Waititi says, the media are enjoying it, there is an element to that. And I think you could have, if you were him, if I put myself in his shoes, you might have felt that way. Here's an example of what I was talking about. This is Sam Hayes and Tova O'Brien. It was sort of summing up the week on 3 News last Friday.
Clear as mud, but that's the trajectory. That's a single week in the Pāti Māori saga.
That has got to be one of the messiest political implosions in recent memory. I'm thinking, you'll be thinking shades of Jamie Lee Ross and the Southern Bridges saga even.
This is one for the ages. Eat your heart out. Jamie Lee Ross, Gora Sharma, Darlene Tana, Gauri Sgaraman, Michael Forbes more recently. But what makes this so spectacularly chaotic is that the party has basically split in two.
Right, so you feel like there's a kind of
get your popcorn
sporting
sort of element to that, which might feel unfair if you were a party that was actually trying to work its way back and get itself organised. But as I was listening to the Spin-Offs Gone by Lunchtime podcast, I think it was Ben Thomas was saying, look, a month ago, that party looked like they won the by-election. They looked like they were absolutely bolted on, and any government of the left or right, whether they were having them in government or not, would have to factor them in to say, so that is a significant political development. And, when so much has not been made clear by the party's own leadership and administration, then, it's fair enough. So what Tova and Sam Hayes are saying there isn't quite wrong, but there was an element of Sam Hayes going, well, what on earth will come next, Tova? And that the fact that they seem to be enjoying the spectacle, which on top of just the coverage of what's actually being said and done and the holes and some of the things they're saying that need filling in by the media, that the media are still pressing them on. I don't know if you need to go down that far down that route of treating it as sort of entertainment.
15 seconds at the end, Colin, and Simon Dallow leaving One News after 18 years. Gee, that's a good knock, isn't it?
Oh, and then I think since 1993 he's been a presenter, which is just extraordinary, and I can barely think of an occasion where he's, so much as flubbed on screen. So and he doesn't want to appear on Mediawatch and be interviewed because he says he's not the story.
Colin, thank you. Catch you next week.